Hello. So I am so excited to be giving this presentation today. This was my favorite text that we read. So my name is Irene. I'm going to be covering the second half of Edelman's text. And so we split it. Pages 18 to 23 is going to be covered by Human in a written portion. And then pages 24 to 29, I'm going to cover in this video format. So let's get started. So I'm going to be covering 3 topics today. We're starting with Talking LeConte, and then I'm going to be talking about Big Mouth, which is a TV show. If you haven't seen it, I really recommend just watching the first episode, just to get some context of what I'm talking about. And then the last section is going to be called Modern Queerness. So here we go. So I wrote Talking LeConte, clarifying concepts because it helps my brain so we can talk about other stuff. So I think it's really important to just go through a couple basic definitions. Even though we read left to right, we're going to be going the other way around because I think it just helps a little bit. So the first thing I have is, so the way that Prof. Bobby set it up is you have the symbolic, the imaginary, and the real, and then the death drive. And then, yeah. So the first thing is the symbolic, which I wrote is, so I have is the lexicon through which the subject's knowledge, concepts, and reality lives in, the system of meanings ascribed to all, which is constrained by the hierarchies and the violence of language. I would love to get into so many things, but I only have 10 to 15 minutes. So I'm going to just kind of say things, and then if I have time at the end, I'll go back and clarify some information. So then we have the next definition, which is the imaginary. So the child recognizes an imaginary other when they look into a mirror. It's a separation of the self and other outside of self that still exists as the self. And this can still be described through the mental dictionary and the mental lexicon that exists, that's constrained by language. So when it comes to the imaginary, you have like I said, the separation of the self, and then there is the existence of an other outside of the self that is still recognized as the self, yet is an imaginary other, right? So it's living in another plane. Then we have real, excuse me, which I wrote is the fun part, the existence of not quite a reality, but a ness, some sort of being, some sort of energy, some sort of mechanical the first word that comes to mind is like ATP, right? Like energy, some sort of ness, right? When we give like a being outside of oneself, outside of anything able to be described. There's a sense of its existence, but there's a complexity and failure to its placement as well. So if you've ever read Kurt Vonnegut in Slaughterhouse-Five, the aliens describe, they have a moment where it's like humans can only see this much of actual reality, and it's like there's like a box around their head, and so they think that this tiny little circle is their reality, but in fact it's just a distorted nothingness and fakeness, and what really exists is outside of what humans can see. So that's Kurt Vonnegut's description, and I think that was a really fitting description of the real, because it's like humans can see this much, but even this much that we can see, it's like there's a plastic bag over our heads, so we can't see it. They said there's like a plastic bag over your heads, and you're spun around 20 times, and you're like tied to like a pole or something, and you look out the hole, and you're like, oh yes, reality, and it's like that's not reality. And so I thought that was a good parallel. So the next thing is we have is the death drive, which I put as like the opposition of self-actualization. So the definition of the death drive is kind of really complicated. I put it exists opposing the need to achieve self-realization and self-actualization, and it pushes at the boundaries of the possible, expanding beyond. So thinking of orgasms and explosions, creating this pop, this rupture of reality and existence. So that's what I thought of as the death drive. It's just pushing beyond the boundaries of the possible, and it's the opposite. So self-actualization is like this perfect little angel. The death drive is like destroying and like an explosion, right? So that's what I thought of when it comes to the death drive. So then I put what Edelman proposes to do is only by making the ethical choice of acceding to that position, only by assuming the truth of our queer capacity to figure the undoing of the symbolic and the subject of the symbolic, can we undertake the impossible project of imagining an oppositional political position exempt from the repetitive necessity of reproducing the politics of the signifier. This is so cool. I love Edelman so much because he's basically looking and he's like, we keep assuming that this truth, that these signifiers and these subjects, this subjectification that we have, is what we keep thinking of. And like, we need to push away from that. We need to push away from those. And through the rejection of the subjectation, there we go. I don't even know if that's a word, but think of racialization, but subjectification, if that was a word. So as the same way bodies become racialized, in this sense, bodies become subjects and they become subjectified. Maybe that's the word. But yeah, so Edelman is proposing a general rejection of these signifiers and of this subjectification that is created through these different structures at play. So yeah, that's what we're going to talk about. I would love to talk more about like the child and politics, but I think that's a lot more of the first half. So we're just going to be focusing on the second half. So yeah, now we're going to move into big mouth after we got the definitions out of the way. So I wanted to think of big mouth as like disruptions, fissures, and queerness and children for the future. So thinking of big mouth as something that exists almost as that plastic bag, right? That's in between the real and the imaginary, and the subjects and the subject and the signifiers, something that exists between all of that. What lies there? And I was like, what a perfect actual conceptualization, like as big mouth. So I think of it as like, you could literally, so the child that is compelled to image for the satisfaction of adults, an imaginary fullness thought to want, and thus to want for nothing. And I just think it's the existence of the child as for adults. And I was like, oh my God, literally what better to represent that than a show about children for adults. So I think of it as if you could literally take the child, even though the child serves as a meta/hyperphysical representation of perpetuating the system of the imaginary and the symbolic, and take the child and serve her for human purposes, you would get Big Mouth. It's a show in its grotesque fetishization of middle schoolers. It exists as an odd disruption, and I think it creates its own death drive existing outside of the boundaries of the possible. So the death drive is doing things that humans know are bad for them, and sexuality names that part of you that keeps going back to something you don't understand, right? So Big Mouth serves as this fissure, as this point of disruption, not only for heteronormativity, but for embracing sexuality and all of its monstrosity and its complexity. So embracing that senselessness of our own experience through a grotesque and comedic, picturesque, like ridiculous animated way, and labels like serving out exist as restrictions, and Big Mouth in its like depiction of sex and sexuality existing outside of all of this. So I think of Big Mouth as like a conceptualization and like a physicality, like a physical tangible example of something that exists outside of the boundaries of what's possible. So pushing the boundaries and the boundaryless subjectations of the possible. So yeah. So now we're going to get into modern queerness. So here's my thing. There is a new generation of queer figures, and can these theories and concepts from beyond just Edelman still be applied? So Edelman says, but there are no queers in that future, as there can be no future for queers. The future itself is kid stuff, reborn each day to postpone the encounter with the gap, the void, the emptiness that gapes like a grave from within the lifeless mechanism of the signifier, right? That ridiculous, stupid signifier that animates the subject by spinning the gossamer web of the social reality within which that subject lives, right? So we have this like, the future exists in this reborn, this reconstruction almost within these gaps, right? That's why I use Big Mouth, because Big Mouth to me is like a tangible example of that. So within these gaps, there lies the future, but there cannot be queers in that future. But I disagree. I think we are approaching an era where the child is queer, which questions the entire concepts that Edelman has been introducing the majority of this time. I think there exists a space and a being that is not right. And of course, when I talk about queerness and things, we think of queerness as like figures, as I'm hesitant to use the word bodies here because I think that creates a humanity not humanity, but a physicality that I'm not quite sure I want to touch upon today. But when we think of queerness as a figure, I think we're getting to an era where the child is queer. And so how can we sit there and say, oh yes, the child exists in opposition to queerness when I don't necessarily think that's the case anymore. So Prof. Bobby said this at the end of the lecture. He said, queerness itself has more of a set of meanings attached to it. It has its own aesthetic, but queer, as in what Edelman is trying to suggest, is trying to recover an understanding of queer closer to Cedric as something that cannot be captured. But I argue that there no longer exists this idea of queerness as opposition to the child, because there is quite literally queer children, even in their own metaphysical, like outside of the physical and into the imaginary, if you will. There is a queer child that exists within that. In all of the rights, right, discussed of the queer figures and queer bodies, I think this disgust, while extremely prevalent, is slowly disintegrating with the upheaval and continuation of queerness in its complexity. I'm looking at the figure of Gonzo in the ballerina and wearing a dress, and I'm looking at other young transgender figures. For example, like this is a drag queen that's 11 years old that was covered in 2018, actually. So that's even pretty old. I'm thinking of children at pride parades. I'm thinking of Jazzy, who's one of the first young transgender people. The surge of young generations using gender fluid language and terms, even the concepts of experimentation have been going away. So I was having a conversation with my friends, and like experimenting with your sexuality, I'm seeing is something that we view as younger generations as like kind of fucked up. It's like we look at it as like, if you lie within these boundaries or if you lie outside of these boundaries, you just kind of have a feeling there's not really a necessity to experiment as much, at least with the people that I've seen and in my friend group. And so I think there's changes that are here and that are coming. And so I don't necessarily know if Edelman's ideas can be proposed and they can be something that's like valid to this day. So I wrote this piece, like the majority of the texts that we've read throughout the term, are time period dependent. The focus of defining queerness as existing through or within or without the boundaries of liminal spaces has not only become accepted, therefore denying the revolutionary potential it previously had, but it's made its way to the mainstream. We now exist outside of these boundaries. And it was interesting because Prof. Bobby ended on questioning the value that we ascribe to these meanings and these labels. And what I want to do is question the value of our texts that we've been reading throughout this course. While the value of historical texts can't be denied, I want to see readings on more modern queer theories, the inclusion of different kinds of terms. For example, looking into non-binary people and racial studies, that was something that was not really covered. Exploring intersectionality, the concepts of two spirits. In one of my conferences, one of the students brought up South or Southeast Asian drag figures that aren't labeled as drag figures but are their own persona. I want to talk about exploring sexuality in this new age while also learning the history of the old. I ended my little notes with, it disappoints me that the Queering for the Future paper that ends our term was written before the majority of my classmates were even born. And this was written in 1997 and I was born in 2003. So I think we have grown so much as a society, and I want to see our texts reflect that. So I did want to include some discussion questions. The first one is covering my first topic, which was talking Leconte. So is Edelman right in saying that the queer figure opposes the child? Is this still applicable today? I think the existence of queer children in both their metaphysical existence and the imaginary proves that I don't think that they do anymore. But what do you think? I'm looking at Big Mouth. Can you think of other examples of fissures or gaps between queer identities and changing and representations of changing social norms? Right? And thinking of the child and adults and fissures and gaps. Like, can you think of anything? And the last one I have is, do you agree in my ideas of queer theory? I can be crazy and wrong a lot of times. And I'm pretty young. I'm only 18 and we're still learning, but these are, yeah, so what do you think? And yeah, that's my presentation. I hope you enjoyed. Yeah, thank you so much. Bye.